Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Twilight of the Neocons. With the averting of war with Syria at the last second and the opening of some kind of dialogue with Tehran, it would appear Washington's neocons and armchair generals are falling on hard times. Ever since the end of the Cold War, Washington has always been in need of an enemy. Talking to Iran certainly is one of their worst nightmares. So, is there a plan B? To crosstalk what's next for the neocon agenda, I'm joined by Grant Smith in Washington. He is the director of the Institute for Research, Middle Eastern Policy. And in San Francisco, we cross to Bruce Fein. He is the founder and president of the National Commission on Intelligence and Foreign Wars. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Grant, if I can go to you first in Washington, let's go through the countries: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Egypt, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Israelis. The list can go on. But they're not picking up the phone too often when Washington's calling because no one's really listening anymore. Agree or disagree?
Oh, I don't know about that. I think, in your setup, you mentioned the neoconservative plan for Syria and the brick wall. But if you look at what's been going on ever since the first hardcore neoconservative doctrine for the region was laid down in the 1996 Clean Break Plan, you can kind of do a checklist for Syria. And what have we seen? We've seen the Syria Accountability Act of 2003, which severely limited U.S. diplomatic engagement with the country. We've seen that Syria has not been allowed to engage in any sort of negotiations over the Golan Heights. We've seen the recommendation by the neoconservatives to Netanyahu, but implemented by Bush, to continually have harassment and open attacks on the regime. We've seen the delegitimization of the country. There's been perhaps a setback, although the Clean Break and other neoconservative doctrine has never actually called for open U.S. conflict with Syria. If you look at Syria in particular, those points I mentioned, about 100% of the neocon ask has been met, and for all intents and purposes, moving toward chemical weapons disarmament and having the president already declared he's willing to attack is a win.
Well, okay, Grant, it's interesting. It's interesting what you say, because it makes it sound like success is defeat here. Bruce, you want to jump in? Go right ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think Grant misses the forest for the trees. The fact is, the American people, by overwhelming margins, like 4,000 to 1, and I spoke to maybe 24 members of Congress after the recess who had consulted their constituents on whether we ought to initiate war against Syria, whether for use of chemical weapons or otherwise. And it was that staggering opposition that caused the president to flinch and decide, no, he'd look for another alternative to avoid embarrassing defeat, which would have been overwhelming in the House of Representatives. Now, the reason why this is a turning point is that in no other situation since the Cold War ended has the Congress of the American people turned so decisively and vocally against this idea of empire. We intervene everywhere around the world because we have some obligation to save humanity from disaster, and that our national security interests are implicated no matter what happens, whether it's Burundi or Rwanda or Syria or otherwise. A staggering opposition. Up until that time, we were in Kosovo, we were in Bosnia, even the Iraq War, the phony weapons of mass destruction. The public opposition remained rather quiet and tepid, but here it was so overwhelming. The American people want the United States to defend its own interest here at home.
Well,
we don't go abroad in search of monsters.
But do you think anyone inside the world,
Bruce,
is anyone in the Beltway going to listen?
Really
Go ahead.
Has the neoconservative plan for the region been at all thwarted? And I agree with you that there was a massive uprising, popular discontent with wars. But that wasn't the question. The question really was, has this driving force, which has been mysteriously transplanted now into the Obama administration with his declarations at the UN of American exceptionalism and every bit of baggage that carries, has a neoconservative design on the region been thwarted? My contention is About 70% of that agenda has been completed, and kind of the leftover items are rebuilding, to some extent, Israel's economy away from socialism, and some minor points along the lines of the U.S.-Israel relationship, including lessening U.S. pressure over them. But my argument isn't that there wasn't massive backlash against another ill-advised intervention. My point is simply that there's no indication that there's been any defeat of the designs of the major foreign policy drivers in Washington. They may have had a setback by rather
I would disagree.
Imprudently jumping on Obama's
all right. Let's go to Bruce.
Congress,
let's go to Bruce in San Francisco. Good point, Grant. Bruce in San Francisco. Go ahead.
No, but I think that's incorrect reading of the situation, Grant. Look at the neocons. If we view them as the voices of John McCain and Lindsey Graham, they wanted to attack Syria. They want almost immediately to threaten and to invade and attack Iran in the event that some national security surveillance says that they've got a nuclear weapon. They wanted us to be involved in the transition, however bad it was, from Mubarak to whoever was going to be ruling in Egypt. They want the United States to be there controlling the political destinies of all those countries, including those in the Persian Gulf. And in my judgment, that has clearly been defeated. We simply are not given the American public opinion and the turning away from the Congress of this military projection everywhere to be held morally and otherwise responsible for the fate of everything that moves, including the pressure that, the neocons wanted to go in Darfur in Sudan. And I think that's clearly out of the question given the sentiments today. It's true that if you look far enough back, there are neocon gains that you're identifying. But if you're projecting forward, I think this is the turning point. It is what Winston Churchill would call the beginning of the end.
Grant, would you?
Well, I would disagree with that. You're looking at one small victory in what's been a rise since pretty much the late 70s, 1980s of hardcore policy from this movement. If you look at a single victory that was snatched from the jaws of defeat and ignore that all of the policy apparatus, all of the political appointees who have been embedded into U.S. government, all of the fundraising to keep people like McCain and Lindsey Graham in power, none of that has gone away. And the moment that the U.S. public is distracted, there is not going to be another chance for an uprising. If Obama, in fact, had simply taken the decision, as no doubt many of his advisors had urged him to do, then it wouldn't have mattered. So I really think that the celebration is much, much, much too early.
Okay, Bruce? Go ahead, because I've never seen the American people play a big role when it comes to this neocon agenda, particularly in the Middle East. Only when Obama goes to Congress we actually have an opinion out there in the heartland. You can't extrapolate from one example.
Opinion, Peter.
Go ahead, Bruce. Go ahead.
No, well, Grant, I walk right in front of the White House every day on the way to work, and I've never seen a sign out there saying we need more intervention in the Middle East, in Asia, the pivot toward Asia, or otherwise. Not a single sign, and they have a lot of bizarre signs out in front of the White House. And the fact is, this is the first time I say Syria is an example, the first time in decades where the American people vocally stood up and the president flinched and they said no by overwhelming majorities, over 4,000, 5,000 to 1. And this was uniform across every single congressional district. And we had members like Nancy Pelosi defending the president, even though her own district was like 99 to 1 against going to war. Now, I agree. That doesn't mean that trend is going to continue forever, because nothing is foreordained in history. But in terms of a landmark change in the sentiments of the American people and where the United States is going, that was huge, because it sends a message in the future to all other countries. Well, maybe the United States is not going to intervene in the future. We can do things, and we won't confront predator drones and other military intervention by the United States. And the United States needs to get back to defending its people.
Let's get an example here.
Let's get an example. And trying to remake the world.
Grant, if the United States is going, Grant, let me ask you a question. Grant, let me ask you a question. So the United States, Obama, because of pressure from the Saudis, from the Israelis, they're going to attack Iran. Do you think he's going to ask the American people, oh, is this a good idea to attack Iran? No, that's never going to happen. The reason why he went to the American people on Syria, because he'd painted himself into a corner. You have to thank Mr. Putin for this, not the American people. Sorry.
Well, he did paint himself into a corner.
Well,
but,
I
you know,
simply can't agree with that.
I
disagree.
Behind the president whenever there's been a triggering event, whether it's the Gulf of Tonkin, whether it's Pearl Harbor, you know, all of the groups that are lobbying for non-intervention tend to disappear after a catalyzing event takes place. And the region at this point is just absolutely on a hair trigger for that sort of thing to happen. You know, if you really look skeptically, we have Russia, which announced to the UN in a report early this year that the rebels had used chemical weapons. And then we have more attacks. And then suddenly we have allegations probably provided by Israeli intelligence that, no, it was the Syrian government. And to this day, I haven't seen any credible intelligence, anything other than assertions, giving a clear idea of who did that. Now, the next triggering event that just happens to fold neatly into the bigger goal of regime change in Iran is likely out there. The tripwire may already be set. We don't know. But Americans, unfortunately, are somewhat the weak link in this decision process. If you look back at history,
I disagree.
All right, gentlemen, we have to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the Neocon agenda. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing what's next with the neocons. Okay, go back to Bruce in San Francisco. We were talking about, Grant was talking about the American people, a possible attack on Iran, and public opinion. So, Bruce, go ahead, weigh in, agree, disagree.
I disagree with the idea that American public opinion rallies behind the president no matter what the war caused in the manner of Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was quite different. There was ocular evidence. There clearly was an attack. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution that Grant mentions, that's based upon a phony, fraudulent claim of a second torpedo attack that history shows was known to the executive branch at the time the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was passed. And it was ultimately the American people, after told so many lies about Vietnam, forced the end of the war. Similarly, the American people experienced in Iraq, and other lies about weapons of mass destruction and suppression of truthful evidence. And so American people now are much more suspicious of non-Pearl Harbor type evidence that suggests that we have an urgent need to use military force to protect our interests. For example, President Obama was saying, well, the Syrians are likely to use chemical weapons against our soldiers someplace in the United States, you know, unless we make this red line retaliation against President Assad, which no American really believes that the Syrians are going to be using chemical weapons, you know, against the United States. And in the future, in my judgment, the American people have been so misled, so chronically about dangers, inflating them a millionfold and equating even Al-Qaeda to the equivalent of Adolf Hitler's Luftwaffe and the Soviet Red Army and Hirohito's Zero pilots, that they become very skeptical, especially at a time when we have a very, very austere economic situation where we can't even afford, with a $17 trillion natural debt, to go abroad and try to save the world for every kind of evil that we discern.
Okay, Grant, stay with it.
Yeah, well, I wish,
go ahead, but I'd like to talk a little bit about Iran. Go ahead, Grant, go ahead.
Basically, the premise here is that there's a thawing in relations with Iran. And to me, the idea that the two presidents have exchanged letters doesn't represent a thawing of relations with Iran. What would represent a thawing? getting out from behind the skirts of the Swiss and actually having some sort of diplomatic representation in Tehran would be something real, perceptible, as Bruce would say. Getting all of these Israel lobby operatives and political appointees out of the Treasury Department and putting in people who actually are career civil servants as opposed to political operatives would be good. Actually talking about what Rouhani mentioned, that the sanctions are mainly targeting the weakest segment of his society. But at this point, you know, just simply exchanging letters and trying to engineer a handshake looks like box checking to me. And I don't see any breakthrough whatsoever with Iran. These pleasantries are underneath an overarching wall of economic warfare. The United States apparently hasn't ordered Israel to stop assassinating Iranian scientists or engaging in their hostile activities. So I just don't see it. I don't see anything, frankly.
Okay, Bruce, what do you see?
Well, listen, I agree with Grant by and large that these are largely ornamental. It was like said at the Paris Peace Conference over Vietnam. They agreed on the shape of the table and what kind of water should be in the glasses, but little else. But in my judgment, the real crux of the problem is that we have a very grossly skewed and uneven-handed application of nuclear proliferation protocols. For example, the so-called gold standard, the 1970 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, it gives 5 countries and 5 only the right to have nuclear weapons, not based upon morality, but just because they had big power clout at the time. Great Britain, France, China, Russia, and the United States. So what does that look like? We have 4 other countries now with nuclear weapons outside the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Pact, and that's Israel, Pakistan, India, North Korea. And suddenly now Iran, it's going to be a cause of war if they develop a nuclear capability. Where does that come from? How come other countries got to have nuclear capabilities and no one's attacking them and saying that's a casus belli? And it's just a feature of human nature. You've got to have even-handed application of principles here if you're going to have a dynamic that's going to reach a
I agree with you
conclusion.
in principle, Bruce, but I mean, what is even-handed about Saudi foreign policy and Israeli foreign policy when it comes to Iran? Grant.
Well, look, the cat's out of the bag. I mean, the United States has not only failed to enforce the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, it's allowed Israel to obtain know-how, material, financial support from various so-called charities in the United States to build the deadliest arsenal in the entire region. And, of course, the answer to Bruce's question is why the uneven-handedness? Well, Israel wants to have a country in their region, no country that is effectively able to deter their nuclear weapons capability. I would argue that the United States, by not enforcing the Atomic Energy Act and by allowing all of this technology flow to continue, is really complicit in undermining the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is probably one of the most important treaties ever passed. And that's, you know, again, getting back to this exceptionalism where Israel and the United States, in this case, claim that they're really not subject to any of these rules.
Yes. That's true. Bruce, you want to reply to that? Go ahead.
But, Grant, I think that's a cornerstone. That's a cornerstone, Grant, of this neocon theory of international relations and projecting the United States and Israel as the master races over all the rest of the globe. And one of the debates that we've had here as well,
one of the most interesting things to come out of the Edward Snowden,
where the neocon theories are under attack.
Go ahead, Grant.
Right. Well, they should be under attack, but they've already been embedded in key U.S. agencies. One of the frightening things that came out of Glenn Greenwald's report on September 11 was the NSA saying its prime directive for the Middle East was that the advancement and security of Israel was the paramount U.S. interest in the region. Well, I don't remember voting on that. I know AIPAC and other organizations try to put that as a plank in the political parties, but where in the world did that come from? And I don't think we're in disagreement saying that these are not American interests. It's as though a gigantic catbird has flown into every agency, pushed out the egg of American interest, and laid a blue and white egg that is extremely self-serving, usually secret, and enormously destructive.
Interestingly put,
it's not a
Bruce.
catbird.
Yes,
It's
and
a
I think
cowbird.
what the also disclosure showed that the NSA was sharing all of its metadata
Yes.
collection and other information with the Israeli intelligence services, unredacted. But I go back, Grant. I think we agree. Then this is at least a sharp dagger into the neocon theory of the world in international relations, where we are cheek by jowl with Israelis. We do everything they ask us to do. That's a cornerstone of the neocon thinking, and I think that is crumbling. And I think that's a very important turning point in the United States foreign policy.
I agree with that, Grant.
Yeah, I
Go
don't think
ahead.
it's crumbling, because the revelation in that memo was that the United States had passed unredacted, raw NSA intelligence to the Israelis, a couple of months after Obama was entering office. So here he is entering office with his team, freeing a couple of the lobby's people who had been accused of espionage and giving away unredacted intelligence on the American people. This is unforgivable. It's something that Americans should be in uproar over, but it's still in place as far as I know. So I just don't see this weakening, other than, again, the popular uprising, which is fickle. It might happen again. It might not, if Americans can be sufficiently disinterested or distracted. There's no indication of any waning in this horrible agenda. Obama is implementing it at the rate.
I think it's nuanced, Grant. I think it's nuanced here, because I started out the program here. I mean, a lot of Pakistani officials, and I'm talking to Bruce right now, they don't want to talk to Obama because of the drones. And forget talking to anyone in Baghdad, because they can do whatever they want. I mean, give us the money or whatever. We're still aligned with Iran. The Saudis, well, they're working with the Israelis on a new plan B, to attack Iran. I mean, I don't see that the neocon agenda is really worked out all that well, because it's been put in play, and now Washington is standing on the sidelines. Bruce.
Yeah, and I want to underscore, perceptions. It's like Plato's allegory of the caves. Perceptions or appearances are reality, and the fact is that AIPAC and the Israeli lobby, so to speak, was vigorous in trying to urge Congress to authorize war against Syria, and this was a huge defeat for them. They were crushed. And that sort of demolishes the aura of invincibility that surrounded AIPAC,
Bruce,
and in the future it's going to count.
Misperception.
I agree with Grant. Things
AIPAC
don't change over time.
Works best in the dark. When you call AIPAC out at the last minute and tell it to organize a massive campaign to move Congress from a place that is uncomfortable to a place that's even more uncomfortable, it's not going to win. But that's not a show of AIPAC's weaknesses. That's simply a show of that it likes to and prefers to and operates more efficiently in the dark. Well, we're entering a dark period now as the federal agencies shut down and Americans become even more preoccupied with the economy. That plays into AIPAC's favor. AIPAC is not getting smaller, Bruce. It's getting bigger. And again, I have to harken back to this idea of exceptionalism. I mean, I agree with Bruce. The neoconservative exceptionalism in this region is stating that Israel and the United States are above the law. They don't really have to listen to anybody else. Well, what other regimes have marched under the banner of exceptionalism? Imperial Japan, the Volks movement that arose in Germany over nationalism.
Well, these
things don't end
I want to give Bruce the last word of the program. Bruce, go ahead. 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Yeah. Listen, I think Grant and I agree on this score. I guess the only point of disagreement is whether this represents a trend that's going to ultimately throw back the neocon high water mark, or whether it's simply a temporary speed bump for the neocons. And my belief is, and I'm up in Congress virtually every single day, involved in talking about these issues.
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to have to end the debate here. We've run out of time. Many thanks today to my guests in Washington and in San Francisco. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love you.